Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. My sister used a Ouija board to talk to our late mother. Now she's having nightmares. Every night, when my sister Kate told me she bought a Ouija board, I thought she was joking. Kate's the last person you'd expect to mess around with anything paranormal. She's the kind of person who checks under her bed twice before she goes to sleep. But ever since our mum passed last year, she hasn't quite been herself. So when she said she bought a board to try and talk to mum, I didn't know whether to laugh or be worried. The first time she tried it, I wasn't home. I was out with friends, trying to get a break from all the heaviness that had settled over our house. But when I got back that night, Kate looked different. She was pale, almost like she hadn't seen sunlight in days. Her eyes had this distant look, like she'd just come out of a long dream. "Did it work?" I asked, half joking, but part of me was genuinely curious. She gave a small nod, barely meeting my eyes. I think I heard her," she whispered. Now, I don't believe in that stuff, not really. But the look on her face was enough to make me second-guess myself. I brushed it off, told myself she was just missing Mom, that it was probably her mind playing tricks on her. But that's when things started getting weird. The first night after her session, I woke up to her screaming. I rushed into her room to find her sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat, her eyes wide and terrified. "What's going on? Are you okay?" I asked, trying to calm her down. She didn't answer at first, just stared at the wall with this haunted expression. Finally, she looked at me and whispered, "I saw her." "Mom?" I asked, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. Kate nodded, hugging her knees. "But it wasn't really her. She looked wrong." I sat with her until she calmed down, but the whole thing left me rattled. I kept telling myself it was just a dream, that grief was making her see things. But the next night, it happened again, and the night after that. Every night, like clockwork, Kate would wake up screaming, saying she'd seen Mum. But each time, she'd describe something worse. Mum's face twisted into a smile that didn't belong to her, her eyes wide and staring, her hands reaching out as if she wanted to pull Kate into some dark place. I tried to get her to stop using the board, but she wouldn't listen. It was like she was obsessed, convinced that if she could just talk to Mom one more time, everything would go back to normal. Then one night, I heard her whispering in her room, talking in this low, desperate voice. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but something in her tone made me freeze. She was asking questions, but the words were muffled, like she was trying to keep it all to herself. And then, I heard her laugh. But it wasn't her normal laugh. It was this strange, nervous giggle, like she was on the edge of something she didn't understand. I knocked on her door, and the laughter stopped. She opened it, looking as pale as ever, her hands shaking. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "No one," she mumbled, avoiding my gaze. "Just talking to myself." I didn't push it, but that night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing her voice, that strange laughter echoing in my mind. Something was wrong, and it felt like it was only getting worse. After that night, Kate's nightmares only got worse. I'd hear her muttering in her sleep, these low, almost frantic whispers like she was talking to someone. I tried waking her up a few times, but each time she'd just blink at me, confused and barely awake, like she didn't even know I was there. Then one morning, I walked into the kitchen to find her sitting at the table, staring at a spot on the wall. Her eyes were vacant, and she was pale, like she hadn't slept in days. "Kate, are you okay?" I asked, trying not to sound as freaked out as I felt. She didn't answer, just kept staring. her fingers twitching slightly on the table. Finally, she looked up at me, and I'll never forget what she said. "She's mad at me." I felt a cold chill run through me. "Who's mad at you?" "Mum," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I asked too many questions and now she's not happy." I tried to shake it off, telling myself she was just tired, that the nightmares were messing with her head. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I hadn't believed in any of this stuff before, but now, I didn't know what to believe. That night, I heard her talking again. I pressed my ear to her door, heart pounding, straining to make out what she was saying. Her voice was soft, almost pleading, like she was trying to reason with someone who wasn't there. Then, just as I was about to walk away, she said something that made my blood run cold. "Please, don't make me go with you." I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My instinct screamed at me to open the door, to pull her out of whatever nightmare she was trapped in. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I felt like there was something in that room with her, something that didn't want me there. The next day, Kate didn't say much. She avoided eye contact, her face pale and drawn, her hands fidgeting like she was nervous about something. I wanted to bring it up, to ask her if she was still using the Ouija board, but I couldn't find the words. I was afraid of what she might say. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, the creak of floorboards, the faint sound of whispering, like there was someone moving through the house. Every time I got up to check, there was nothing. Just shadows cast by the streetlights outside, shifting and twisting in ways that felt wrong, like they were watching me. At around 3 a.m., I heard a noise from Kate's room, a low scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. I got up, my heart racing, and slowly made my way down the hall. I knocked on her door, and there was a moment of silence before she answered, her voice barely a whisper. "She's here." I didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do. I just stood there, frozen, as that horrible, scraping sound continued, filling the silence between us. It was like something was scratching at the walls, clawing its way closer. I wanted to go in, to pull her out of whatever nightmare she was trapped in, but some invisible force held me back. It felt like there was a presence on the other side of that door, something cold and malevolent, something that didn't want me to interfere. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I went back to my room, lying awake in the darkness, my mind racing. Whatever was going on with Kate, it wasn't just in her head. Something had followed her back from that session with the Ouija board, something that wasn't our mum, and the worst part, I had no idea how to stop it. The next day, Kate looked worse than ever. Dark circles under her eyes, her face pale and drawn, like she hadn't slept in days. She barely spoke, only muttering a few words when I asked if she was okay. It was like she was fading, a shadow of herself, slipping away bit by bit. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something, so I confronted her. "Kate, what's going on? You're scaring me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you still using the Ouija board?" Her reaction was instant. Her eyes widened, and for a second, pure terror flashed across her face. She shook her head, but I could tell she was lying. "Kate, you have to stop," I said, my voice more urgent. "This isn't helping. Whatever you're seeing, it's not Mom." Her gaze shifted to the floor, her hands twisting in her lap. Then she whispered, "I tried to stop, but she won't let me." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" Kate looked up, and there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Fear, deep and desperate. "She keeps calling me, every night. I can't ignore her." I didn't know what to say. How do you argue with something that doesn't make sense? I wanted to tell her it was all in her head, that she was just grieving, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She truly believed something was reaching out to her, something dark. That night, I decided I wasn't going to let her face it alone. I didn't tell her, but I stayed awake, listening for any sound from her room, any sign that she was in trouble. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the soft, scraping sound from behind her door, like nails dragging along the wall. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage, and slowly opened her door. The room was dark, but I could just make out Kate sitting on the floor, hunched over the Ouija board, her fingers trembling as they rested on the planchette. "Kate," I whispered, but she didn't react. Her gaze was fixed on the board, her eyes wide and unfocused, like she was in some kind of trance. I stepped closer, reaching out to shake her shoulder, but before I could touch her, the planchette jerked across the board, spelling out a single word: leave. My heart skipped a beat. Kate's face twisted in fear, and she looked up at me, finally snapping out of her trance. "It's not Mum," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what it is, but it's pretending to be her." We both stared at the board, the air in the room thick with tension, as if something unseen was watching us. I grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet. "We're done with this," I said, my voice shaking. "This thing, whatever it is, it's lying to you. It's not her." Kate nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, the hesitation. It was like this thing had its claws in her, whispering promises that she couldn't ignore. She clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, our mum was still out there, reaching out to her, but I knew better. I could feel it, this dark presence lingering in the room, watching us with cold, malevolent intent. We left the board on her floor, not daring to touch it again, and went to the living room. Neither of us slept that night, sitting there in silence, afraid that if we closed our eyes, something would reach out and pull us into that dark place Kate had seen in her nightmares. The next morning, I made her promise she wouldn't use the board again. She agreed, but there was something in her expression, a hint of doubt, like she wasn't sure she could resist its call. As I left her room, I glanced back at the board, still sitting there, untouched, but somehow different. The planchette had moved on its own, now pointing to a single letter, H. I didn't know what it meant, didn't want to know, but deep down, I had a feeling that whatever it was, this thing wasn't done with us. After that night, the atmosphere in our house changed. It felt heavier, like something dark was lurking in every shadow, watching our every move. I tried to keep a brave face, telling myself that I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. But there was something in the air, a coldness that settled in every room, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Kate was quieter too, moving around like a ghost in her own home. She kept looking over her shoulder, flinching at every small sound. It was like she was waiting for something, expecting something to appear at any moment. One night, as I was heading to bed, I noticed her door was slightly open. I peeked inside, and there she was, sitting up in bed, staring at the empty space in front of her with wide, fearful eyes. "Kate," I whispered, stepping into her room. She didn't respond, didn't even look at me. It was like she was in a trance, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. "Kate," I said, louder this time, reaching out to touch her shoulder. The moment I touched her, she snapped out of it, gasping as if she'd just woken from a nightmare. She looked at me, eyes filled with terror, and whispered, "She was here." "Who?" I asked, my heart racing. "Mum, or whatever's pretending to be her," she said, her voice trembling. She was standing right there by the door. She was smiling at me, but her eyes, they were all wrong. I swallowed hard, glancing at the empty space where she'd been looking. There was nothing there, just shadows stretching across the floor. But the air felt colder, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. That's when I knew it wasn't just Kate. This thing, whatever it was getting stronger, more present. It was no longer confined to her nightmares or the Ouija board. It was here, in our house, lurking in the dark corners, waiting for us to acknowledge it. I decided to get rid of the board once and for all. I waited until Kate went to work the next morning, then went into her room, grabbed the Ouija board and took it out to the backyard. I dug a hole, threw the board in and covered it with dirt, hoping that burying it would sever whatever connection it had to our home. But that night, things got worse. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was pacing back and forth just outside my door. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I sat up, gripping my blanket, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. I thought about calling out, but something in the back of my mind warned me not to. It was as if some instinct was telling me that acknowledging it, speaking to it, would only make it stronger. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, this time moving down the hall toward Kate's room. I got out of bed and crept to my door, opening it just a crack to peer down the hall. The light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure, a dark silhouette standing at Kate's door, watching her. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I tried to bring it up with Kate, but she was withdrawn, barely responding to anything I said. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hands were shaking, her eyes hollow. "I buried the board," I told her, hoping it would ease her mind. "It's gone. It can't hurt us anymore." But she just shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "It doesn't matter. It's already here." I didn't know what she meant, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the certainty that whatever we were dealing with wasn't bound by a piece of cardboard. That night, as we both lay awake in our rooms, I heard it again. The footsteps, the low, deliberate pacing, moving through the house. This time, it didn't stop at my door or Kate's. It kept going, the sound fading in and out, like it was circling us, drawing closer with every pass. I lay there frozen, listening as the footsteps echoed through the house, knowing that whatever was walking those halls wasn't our mother. It was something else, something dark and ancient, something that had found a way into our lives. And I had a sickening feeling that it wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon. I knew we couldn't go on like this. The house felt poisoned, every room thick with dread. Kate was barely eating, barely sleeping. She looked like a ghost, her skin pale, her eyes sunken, as if whatever had come into our lives was feeding off her. I decided we had to leave, even just for a night. I told her we'd go stay at a hotel, get some distance, maybe clear our heads. She was reluctant, but the fear in her eyes was enough to make her agree. As we packed, I kept telling myself that this would work, that getting out of the house would break whatever hold it had on her. But just as we were about to walk out the door, the lights in the house flickered, then went out completely. The darkness was immediate and absolute, swallowing us whole. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but then I heard Kate whisper, her voice trembling. "Do you see her?" I turned around, and in the dim light from my phone, I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway, partially hidden in the shadows. She looked just like our mum, same height, same hair, same familiar posture. But there was something terribly wrong with her face. Her eyes were too wide, too empty, her mouth stretched into a twisted smile that didn't belong to her. "Kate, don't look," I said, trying to pull her away, but she wouldn't move. She was frozen, staring at the figure, her hand clasped over her mouth. Then the figure spoke, and the voice sent an icy chill down my spine. It was Mom's voice, but it was wrong, hollow, like a distorted recording. "Why are you leaving, Kate?" it asked, stepping closer, its movements slow and unnatural. "Don't you want to stay with me?" I watched as Kate's eyes filled with tears, her whole body shaking. You're not her," she whispered. The figure stopped, tilting its head, as if considering her words. And then, with a sickening smile, it replied, "But I could be, if you let me in." I could feel the weight of its words, the pull, like it was trying to weave its way into Kate's mind, twisting her grief into something it could use. I tightened my grip on her arm, determined not to let her go. "No," I said firmly, stepping between Kate and the figure. "You're not welcome here." The figure's face twisted into a grotesque sneer, the expression contorting into something monstrous. Its eyes darkened, becoming hollow voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. The air grew colder, suffocating, as it whispered in a voice that felt like claws scraping against my skin. "She's mine," it hissed, reaching out with a hand that was too long, too thin, its fingers stretching toward Kate. Desperation took over. I grabbed Kate, pulling her back, trying to ignore the chill that seeped into my bones as the figure's hand grazed my arm. The touch felt like ice, numbing, like it was sucking the warmth right out of me. "Kate, run!" I shouted, shoving her toward the front door. We stumbled out into the night, not daring to look back as we ran to the car. I could feel that heavy presence following us, a dark shadow lurking just out of sight. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, and I had to force myself to take a deep breath to keep my focus. Finally, I got the car started, and we drove away, leaving the house behind us, that oppressive darkness fading in the rearview mirror. We spent the night in a cheap motel on the edge of town, neither of us saying much. Kate was silent, staring out the window, her face pale and hollow. I didn't know how to comfort her, didn't know if there was anything left to say. Whatever that thing was, it had found a way to feed off her grief, to twist her memories into something dark and twisted. The next morning, we returned to the house. Everything was quiet, the air still, as if whatever presence had been there was gone. But the house felt empty, colder somehow, like a piece of it had been hollowed out. I took one last look at Kate as we packed our things. She seemed different, like a weight had been lifted, but there was something else in her eyes, a lingering sadness, a haunted look that told me she'd never be the same. We never spoke about what happened, never mentioned the figure or the words it had whispered. We moved out, leaving the house behind, and eventually, life returned to some version of normal. But every so often, I catch Kate staring into the distance, her eyes distant, as if she's searching for something or someone. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up with the feeling that something is watching me, something cold and ancient, waiting just outside the edges of my vision, and I know deep down that whatever followed us that night, it's still out there, watching, waiting. The Ouija board told me not to go to work today. I wish I'd listened. All right, I know it sounds ridiculous. Who actually listens to a Ouija board, right? I'd always thought they were just for party tricks, something to freak people out at sleepovers. But that was before I got dragged into one of the strangest, most unsettling days of my life. This all started on a random Friday night. My buddy Tom and I were hanging out, bored out of our minds, scrolling through horror movies that all looked the same. At some point, Tom, who's always been the let's do something crazy guy, mentioned that his cousin had left a Ouija board at his place. Now, I'd never been into that stuff, but I figured why not? It was late, we had nothing better to do, and a bit of freakiness sounded kind of fun. We set the board up in the middle of Tom's living room, turned off the lights, and sat across from each other, grinning like idiots. We both knew it was just a piece of plastic, but there was this weird energy in the air, like a mix of excitement and something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. Tom was the one who asked the first question. Is there anyone here with us? Nothing happened at first, just the usual silence. But then, after a few seconds, the planchette moved. It was subtle, just a tiny nudge, but it was enough to get my pulse racing. I thought Tom was messing with me, but his face looked as surprised as mine. Did you just do that? I asked, half laughing, half nervous. He shook his head, eyes wide. No, man, that was all you. We both laughed it off, but deep down, I was starting to get that uncomfortable itch, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up. But hey, we were already in too deep, so we kept going. All right, I said, trying to keep things light. Do you have a message for us? The planchette started moving again, faster this time. It slid over to yes, with this strange, deliberate motion that felt intentional, if that makes sense. I glanced at Tom, and he looked as freaked out as I felt. We were both quiet for a minute, just staring at the board, wondering if maybe we should stop. But then Tom broke the silence. All right, if you're real, tell us something. Give us some advice. The planchette moved instantly, like it had been waiting. It spelled out, slowly and steadily, DONTGOTOWORK. I froze, the words sinking in. Don't go to work. I mean, it was weirdly specific, right? I hadn't mentioned anything about my job, and Tom worked freelance, so it didn't exactly apply to him. But for me, I had a shift the next day at this small local hardware store, the kind of place that's never closed, even on holidays. And the thing was, I was scheduled to work alone that day. Tom laughed it off, like it was some spooky coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aimed right at me. He tried to keep going, asking it more questions, but after that, the planchette just kept moving to goodbye over and over, like it was done with us. After a while, we gave up, laughed it off, and put the board away. Still, I couldn't shake that weird feeling. Don't go to work. It echoed in my head as I drove home that night. The whole thing was stupid, but the words wouldn't leave me alone. Part of me was tempted to call in sick, but I'd already missed a shift last week, and my boss was the kind of guy who kept track. I couldn't afford to lose this job. So, I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a prank my mind was playing on me. The next morning, I woke up groggy, half wishing I'd called in anyway. But I got dressed, grabbed my coffee, and headed to work, still trying to shake off the weird vibes from the night before. When I got to the store, everything seemed normal at first. It was the same dusty aisles, the same faint smell of paint and lumber. I flipped on the lights, unlocked the door, and got ready for what I expected to be a slow day. No one really came in on Saturdays, except the odd DIY enthusiast or someone picking up a few tools. But as the morning dragged on, things started to feel off. At first it was small stuff. A light in the back corner flickered every now and then, casting these strange shifting shadows across the aisles. I brushed it off as bad wiring, which was common in this place. But then, I started hearing these faint noises, like footsteps, soft but deliberate, echoing from the far end of the store. I walked over to check, expecting to see a customer who'd come in quietly. But there was no one there, just empty aisles, filled with the same shelves of tools and supplies. The silence was thick, almost like the air itself was heavy, pressing down on me. I shook it off, trying to focus on stocking some shelves. But every time I turned my back, I felt this prickling sensation, like someone was watching me. I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was always empty. Then, around noon, the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be my boss, or maybe a customer asking about store hours. But all I heard was static. I frowned, waiting, but there was no voice, no sound other than this faint, crackling noise. like an old radio tuned to an empty station. "Hello?" I said, feeling stupid for talking into the silence. And then, barely audible, I heard it. A voice, whispering through the static, soft but unmistakable. "You shouldn't be here." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, heart pounding. It was probably a prank call, I told myself. Maybe some kid messing around, or a crossed line from a radio station. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to last night. The warning, "Don't go to work." I tried to laugh it off, but that eerie whisper kept replaying in my mind. It was just a voice, sure, but it felt like more than that. Like someone, or something, was trying to warn me. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows slipping between the aisles, small and fast, gone before I could focus on them. And the footsteps, they didn't stop. Every so often I'd hear them, soft and deliberate, following me from one aisle to the next. By the time my shift ended, I was practically running out of there. I locked up, not even caring if I'd left things half finished, and sped home, my heart pounding the whole way. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the board, the warning, and that voice on the phone. "You shouldn't be here." And as stupid as it sounds, part of me wondered if that message had come from whatever we'd spoken to last night. Like it was trying to protect me, like it knew something I didn't. But what scared me most was that feeling that I hadn't been alone in that store. And I knew, deep down, that if I went back, whatever it was would be waiting. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing shadows flitting between the aisles, hearing that whisper crackling through the phone. "You shouldn't be here." It echoed in my head like a broken record, refusing to let me rest. By morning, I'd convinced myself that I'd overreacted. I mean, it was just a weird day at work. Old buildings have bad wiring, static happens, and shadows. Well, my imagination was probably running wild. That's what I told myself. So, like a total idiot, I dragged myself out of bed, got dressed, and headed back to the store. When I got there, I half expected the same eerie silence, the same heavy feeling from the day before. But at first, everything felt normal. The sunlight streamed through the windows. The place was bright, ordinary, almost comforting. I flipped on the lights, started my shift, and told myself it was just another Saturday. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Every creak, every faint sound made me jump. The store was completely empty as usual, not a single customer. It felt like I was the only person in the world, surrounded by rows and rows of aisles stretching into this endless silence. Around mid-morning, I started hearing it again. That faint, echoing sound of footsteps, just like before. They seemed to be coming from the back of the store, from the far end near the hardware section. My heart started racing as I listened, my hand tightening around the shelf I was stocking. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, almost hesitant, like someone was trying not to be noticed but didn't care if they were heard. I tried to brush it off, forcing myself to focus on my task. But every time I moved to a different aisle, the footsteps followed, always just a few steps behind, keeping pace with me. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I called out, my voice breaking the thick silence. "Hello? Is someone there?" Nothing. Just the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the faint buzzing of the old air conditioning unit. I waited, straining my ears for any sign of a response, but the footsteps had stopped. I took a deep breath, telling myself I'd imagined it. But as I turned to walk back toward the register, I froze. There, at the end of the aisle, was a shadow. Not just any shadow, it was tall, too tall, with this twisted, elongated shape that didn't belong to any person. It stretched across the floor, cast by something just out of sight around the corner. I stared at it, my mind blank, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But then, slowly, the shadow started moving. It slid across the floor, creeping around the corner, closer to where I was standing. I backed up, my pulse pounding in my ears, unable to tear my gaze away. The shadow seemed to melt, twisting and bending, inching its way toward me. Every instinct screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move, frozen by some primal fear. Just as it reached my feet, the store phone rang, shattering the silence. I jumped, nearly knocking over a display shelf, and bolted for the counter, my heart pounding as I grabbed the phone with a shaking hand. "Hello," I managed, my voice barely a whisper. There was a long stretch of static, crackling and humming, filling my ears with that familiar, uncomfortable noise. And then, just like before, I heard it, a faint, almost pleading whisper. "Why didn't you listen?" My blood turned to ice. This wasn't random. This wasn't some strange glitch or coincidence. Whatever I'd talked to on that Ouija board, it had meant it. It had warned me, tried to keep me away from here, and now it was like it was scolding me, like it was disappointed. Who is this?" I stammered, hoping against hope that it was just a prank. The static shifted, growing louder, almost like a low growl. And then, without warning, the voice whispered one more word: "Run." The line went dead, and I stood there, phone still in hand, my heart racing so hard it felt like it might burst. I didn't need to be told twice. I dropped the phone, not even bothering to lock up, and sprinted out the door, half expecting that shadow to be right behind me, reaching out with those twisted, inhuman limbs. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, hands shaking so badly that I fumbled with the keys. Finally, I managed to unlock the door, threw myself inside, and started the engine, peeling out of the parking lot without a second glance. By the time I got home, I was drenched in sweat, my mind racing. I tried to make sense of it all, but the pieces didn't fit. A Ouija board, a whisper on the phone, and a shadow that seemed to follow me, almost like it was watching. None of it made sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever this was, it wasn't over. I stayed up late that night, pacing my apartment, trying to rationalize everything, but every time I thought I'd found a logical explanation, my mind flashed back to that voice. Why didn't you listen? And then, around 3 a.m., I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from my living room window. My blood ran cold as I stood in the hallway, barely daring to breathe. The tapping was soft, almost polite, like someone trying to get my attention. I knew, without even looking, that I shouldn't go near that window. Whatever was waiting outside, it wasn't human. I backed away slowly, retreating to my room and locking the door. The tapping stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its place. I lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for morning, my mind replaying that whispered warning. When the sun finally rose, I checked the window, half expecting to see some sign of what had been there. But there was nothing, just the empty street, as if nothing had happened at all. I called in sick that day, using every excuse I could think of. My boss wasn't thrilled, but I didn't care. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that store. Whatever was haunting it, whatever had warned me, it was real. And it wasn't finished with me yet. I spent most of the day hiding out in my apartment, trying to convince myself that everything would go back to normal if I just stayed away from work. I even called Tom, half hoping he'd tell me I was crazy, that it was all just my imagination. But the second I mentioned the shadow and the phone calls, he got quiet. "Man, maybe it was more than just a dumb game," he finally said. "That Ouija board, maybe it actually connected us to something. I don't know. Maybe it's warning you because it wants something." The thought was enough to make my skin crawl. If whatever we'd contacted actually wanted something from me, what was it? And why did it want me out of that store so badly? But just as I was about to press Tom for more ideas, I heard something in the background. a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging along wood. It wasn't coming from Tom's end, it was coming from my living room. I froze, gripping the phone, barely able to breathe as the scraping got louder, more insistent. It was coming from my front door. "Tom, I gotta go," I whispered, and hung up before he could respond. I crept over to the door, half expecting to see someone standing outside. But when I peered through the peephole, the hallway was empty. Still, the scraping didn't stop. It echoed through the door, persistent, almost like a warning. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I slowly unlocked the door and opened it a crack, peeking out into the hallway. And that's when I saw it. There, on the floor, just outside my door, was a small folded piece of paper. It looked old, the edges yellowed and frayed, like it had been left there for a long time. I glanced up and down the hallway, but there was no one in sight. The scraping sound had stopped, leaving only the eerie silence. I reached down, hesitating before picking up the paper. Something about it felt wrong, like it was almost waiting for me. But curiosity got the best of me, and I unfolded it, my heart pounding as I read the single, handwritten message inside. "It's not finished with you." I felt a chill run down my spine. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible, like someone had scrawled it in a hurry. I had no idea who had left it or how long it had been there, but one thing was clear. Whatever was haunting me, whatever had warned me not to go to work, wasn't done. And now it had found me outside the store. I slammed the door shut, locking it, and backed away, clutching the note like it was some kind of curse. My hands were shaking, and every instinct was screaming at me to burn it, to get rid of it, to pretend it had never been there. But instead, I found myself folding it up and tucking it into my pocket, as if some part of me needed to hold on to it. Proof, maybe, or maybe just a reminder that I wasn't losing my mind. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the fading daylight made my heart race. By nightfall, I was on edge, my mind spiraling with questions I didn't want to answer. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I stared at the screen, dread pooling in my stomach as I opened the message. "You ignored the warning." My heart stopped. I didn't respond, didn't even dare to breathe, afraid that somehow, whatever was sending these messages could see me. And then, as I sat there paralyzed, another message came through. "Tomorrow, midnight, come alone." I stared at the words, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Tomorrow at midnight? I didn't know what would happen if I went or if I ignored it. Part of me thought I should just throw my phone out the window and pretend none of this was happening. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't make a difference. It had found me once. It would find me again. The next morning, I forced myself to get through the day, trying to pretend I wasn't counting down the hours, waiting for midnight. I felt like a walking ghost, my mind running in circles, replaying every strange thing that had happened since we'd used that Ouija board. And the thought kept gnawing at me, refusing to let me rest. What did it want? By the time night fell, I'd made up my mind. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I couldn't keep living in fear, looking over my shoulder every second, jumping at shadows. I needed answers. And somehow, I knew that midnight meeting was the only way to get them. As the clock crept closer to 12, I grabbed a flashlight, threw on my jacket, and left my apartment, walking through the dark, empty streets. The city felt different at night, quieter, almost unnatural, like it was holding its breath. When I reached the address from the text, my heart skipped a beat. It was the store. The same hardware store I'd worked at, now locked up and dark, every window reflecting back a twisted, warped version of myself. I shivered, gripping the flashlight, and approached the door. To my surprise, it was unlocked, swinging open with a low creak that echoed into the silent aisles. The air was stale, cold, like the place had been abandoned for years instead of just a day. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing through the empty store, and made my way toward the back, where the shadows seemed to gather like they were waiting for me. And then, just as I reached the far end, my flashlight flickered. I smacked it against my hand, cursing, but it only dimmed further, casting long, distorted shadows across the shelves. And that's when I heard it. The same whisper, low and insistent, filling the air around me. "You shouldn't have come!" I whipped around, my heart pounding, but there was no one there, just rows and rows of shelves stretching out into the darkness. The whisper grew louder, closer, and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, though every instinct was screaming at me to run. The whisper paused, and then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, it answered. "I was like you." I ignored the warning. My stomach dropped as the truth settled over me. Whatever was haunting this place, whatever had warned me to stay away, wasn't just some spirit. It was someone, or something, that had made the same mistake I had. Someone who hadn't listened, who had come back one too many times. And now it was trapped here, bound to this store, trying to warn me before it was too late. I took a step back, heart racing, but before I could move, the lights overhead flickered, and for a brief, terrifying second I saw it. A shadow, tall and twisted, reaching out toward me with long, skeletal fingers. Its face was a blur, like it was caught between worlds, flickering in and out of focus. "Leave," it whispered, the voice echoing in my mind, filling my thoughts. "Leave, and don't look back." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, sprinting through the aisles, my footsteps echoing in the empty silence. The shadows seemed to follow, stretching toward me, reaching, but I didn't stop, bursting out the door and into the night, gasping for breath. I didn't look back until I was blocks away, my mind still reeling. I could still hear that final whisper echoing in my mind, haunting me, filling me with a sense of dread that wouldn't go away. I should have listened. And now, whatever was trapped there was making sure I never came back. I spent the next day in a daze, mind racing with everything I'd seen and heard. The shadow, the whispers, it felt like some bad dream I couldn't shake. But even worse was the memory of that warning. Leave and don't look back. I kept telling myself I was done with that store, that I'd never set foot near it again. But as evening crept closer, I started feeling this strange pull. It was like a magnet, drawing me back, planting a sick kind of curiosity in my mind. Despite everything that had happened, I couldn't stop thinking about it, like the store was tugging at me, begging me to return. Around sunset, I finally cracked and messaged Tom, hoping he'd tell me to drop it. But when I told him everything, he just replied, "Dude, you've got to figure this out. That thing is trying to tell you something." Against my better judgment, I found myself slipping on my jacket, grabbing a flashlight, and heading out again. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but I knew that whatever it was waiting for me. I tried to tell myself it was just one more visit, that this was the last time. When I reached the store, the sky was dark and the entire street was eerily empty. It felt like the whole block was abandoned, swallowed by shadows. The windows of the store were dark, reflecting nothing but empty, warped darkness. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed the door open. The second I stepped inside, I felt that familiar chill, the heavy, oppressive air that made my skin crawl. The lights flickered weakly as I moved toward the aisles, casting long shadows that danced and twisted, almost like they were alive. Then, just as I reached the back of the store, The overhead lights went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the pitch black, but the silence around me was suffocating. And that's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like something shifting in the shadows. I shone my light toward the sound, heart pounding, half expecting to see the figure waiting for me. But the aisle was empty, just rows of shelves stretching out into the darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. Just the silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. I took a step back, shining the light in every direction, but no matter where I looked, I felt like something was watching, lurking just out of reach. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, flickering at the far end of the aisle. It was tall and twisted, shifting in the darkness, moving in that unnatural, jerking way. My pulse quickened, and I took a step forward, feeling like I was moving through molasses, every nerve on edge. The shadow began to move, gliding down the aisle toward me, and I backed up, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The closer it got, the colder the air grew, until my breath was visible, each exhale a thin wisp of fog in the frigid air. "Why didn't you listen?" The whisper came, filling the silence, wrapping around me like a fog. It was the same voice, but this time it sounded closer, angrier. My throat went dry as the shadow loomed in front of me, close enough that I could see faint, indistinct features flickering across its face. Eyes that seemed to shift, mouth twisting, each feature blurring, shifting like it couldn't quite settle into one form. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but my voice caught in my throat. All I could do was stare as it reached out, one long skeletal hand stretching toward me, fingers like claws reaching for my arm. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, its voice a raspy, hollow echo that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I took a step back, but the shadow only moved closer, its hand nearly touching me. I felt a chill radiating from it, colder than anything I'd ever felt, like the very life was being drained from the air around me. What do you want?" I stammered, finally finding my voice, even though it came out barely louder than a whisper. The shadow seemed to hesitate, its head tilting, as if considering my question. And then, in a voice so soft I could barely hear it, it answered, "It's not me who wants something. It's the store." The words made no sense, but somehow I understood. This thing, it wasn't haunting the store. It was bound to it, trapped like some cursed relic, a remnant of whatever dark history had seeped into the place. The store itself was alive, feeding off the fear, the curiosity of anyone unlucky enough to wander inside. And now, somehow, I was a part of it. The figure lowered its hand, its empty gaze fixed on me. "Leave," it whispered, each word dripping with warning. "Leave and forget." But even as it said the words, I could feel the pull, the strange, twisted urge to stay, to understand. I wanted to ask it more, to figure out what it was, what it had been. But the shadow only shook its head, as if reading my thoughts, its form flickering in the dim light. "You can't understand," it said, its voice soft, almost mournful. "You don't want to understand." I didn't argue. Every part of me was screaming to leave, to run and never look back. I backed away slowly, my flashlight illuminating the twisted aisles, the shadows stretching and bending as I moved toward the exit. But just as I reached the door, I heard it one last time. A whisper, faint and barely audible, but unmistakable. Once it has you, it doesn't let go. I bolted out of the store, heart pounding, the cold night air hitting me like a shock. I didn't look back, didn't even stop to lock the door. I just kept running, desperate to put as much distance as I could between me and whatever dark thing lurked in those aisles. But even as I reached the street, I could still feel it. That pull, faint but persistent, like a thread tied around my mind, tugging, whispering, urging me back. The store had marked me, somehow, and no matter how far I ran, I knew, deep down, that I'd never truly escape it. I'd felt it in my bones. Once you set foot in a place like that, it stays with you. It feeds off you, growing, waiting, patient as the shadows. And I knew that, sooner or later, it would call me back. For days, I stayed away, trying to live normally, ignoring the gnawing feeling that I'd left something unfinished. But I couldn't escape it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowed aisles, the dark shape reaching for me, the cold warning echoing in my mind. Once it has you, it doesn't let go. I couldn't shake the feeling that the store was still watching me, calling to me, like some invisible thread was tightening around me with each passing day. And the worst part, I started seeing things. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow in my apartment that didn't belong. I'd feel a chill and turn, half expecting to see that twisted figure standing in the room. But there was never anything there. It was like the store had followed me home. The real turning point came one night when I was lying in bed, wide awake, when I heard a faint tapping at my window. I lay there, heart pounding, not daring to move, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. I forced myself to look, expecting to see some twisted shadow waiting for me. But all I saw was a single word, written in condensation across the glass. Come. I don't know what pushed me to do it. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that the fear had seeped so deep into my bones that I couldn't bear it any longer. But something in me snapped. I couldn't live with this thing hanging over me, following me, haunting every moment. So I threw on my coat, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out into the night. The streets were empty, and every sound seemed amplified, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. By the time I reached the store, my hands were shaking, but there was a strange calm too, like I knew this was the only way to end it. The door was unlocked, swinging open with that same heavy creak, and the air inside was thick with that same stale chill. I stepped inside, the darkness closing in around me, and felt the weight of the place settle over me, like I was stepping into another world. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I knew it wouldn't make a difference. I walked to the back, where the shadows seemed to wait, pooling at the edges of the aisles, twisting and shifting as I moved. Then I saw it. The figure was there, standing in the center of the aisle, taller than before, its form more solid, like it had drawn strength from the very walls around it. Its face, though still blurred, seemed almost familiar, as if I was staring at a distorted version of myself. "You came back," it whispered, the voice low and hollow, carrying a strange note of satisfaction. What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely steady. It tilted its head, studying me, its empty gaze piercing. "You came to us. You sought answers where there were none. Now, you belong here." The words settled over me like a weight. I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping it. I'd opened a door that couldn't be closed, called something that couldn't be sent back. The store wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a thing that fed on curiosity, on fear. And now I was part of it. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The air around me felt thick, pressing in, binding me to the spot. The figure took a step forward, its form blurring, shifting, almost as if it was trying to merge with the shadows around it. "It doesn't let go," it whispered, and the words echoed around me, filling my mind. "You are one of us now." I struggled, panic rising, but it was like I was sinking into the floor, pulled down by something unseen. My flashlight flickered, and in the dim, failing light, I saw shadows creeping up my legs, dark tendrils curling around me, holding me in place. "Wait!" I gasped, desperation clawing at my throat. "I don't belong here. I just wanted to understand." The figure leaned close, its face inches from mine, its hollow eyes filling my vision. "And now you do. Welcome to the shadows." The last thing I remember is the cold sinking into my skin, filling me, the darkness wrapping around me, claiming me. My vision faded and I felt myself slipping, like I was being absorbed, erased. When I woke up, it was morning and I was standing outside the store, staring blankly at the closed sign on the door. I felt empty, hollow, like something crucial had been taken from me. I tried to remember what had happened, but the night was a blur, the memories slipping away the harder I tried to grasp them. I looked down at my hands and saw something etched into my palm, faint but unmistakable, an outline of that twisted, shadowed figure burned into my skin like a brand. And somehow, I knew that it wasn't over. I'd left the store, but it hadn't let me go. The shadows had marked me, pulled me into their world. And now, no matter where I went, I could feel it. This dark, creeping presence, lingering just out of sight, waiting, watching. I knew that one day it would call me back, because once it has you, there's no escape. And every night I wait, knowing it's only a matter of time before the shadows come for me again. We asked the Ouija board about my friend's disappearance. It gave us a location and we found something disturbing. I'm not someone who usually believes in the paranormal. Ghosts, spirits, Ouija boards, I always chalk that stuff up to overactive imaginations and creepy movies. But this has me questioning everything. It all started a month ago, when my friend Jake disappeared. One day, he was around, sending dumb memes to our group chat, making plans for the weekend. The next, he was just gone. No texts, no calls, nothing. His family filed a missing persons report, and the police got involved, but they kept coming up empty. No leads, no clues. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Jake and I were close. We'd known each other since grade school, been through every awkward phase and terrible haircut together, and I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I tried to retrace his last steps, checking the places he used to go, but every door led to a dead end. It was frustrating, and as the days turned into weeks, I started losing hope. I was desperate for answers, and that desperation led me somewhere I never thought I'd go. A Ouija board. A friend of mine, Emma, suggested it. She'd always been into the spooky stuff, the type of person who'd sneak into haunted places for fun and read horror stories before bed. She knew I didn't believe in any of it, but she insisted, saying it might give us a clue or something. At first I laughed it off, but then I thought, why not? What was there to lose? So, a few nights later, we were sitting in Emma's dimly lit basement, the Ouija board spread out between us. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad horror movie. Emma had lit candles for atmosphere, and they cast flickering shadows across the walls, making the whole scene feel weirdly intense. We put our fingers on the planchette, and Emma took the lead, closing her eyes and asking, "Is there anyone here who can help us find Jake?" For a few minutes, nothing happened. I felt a little silly, just sitting there in the silence, waiting for a piece of wood to start moving. I was about to call it quits, tell Emma we'd tried, and it was pointless. But then, the planchette moved, just a small twitch at first, like a tiny shiver, but enough to make my pulse spike. "Did you do that?" I whispered. Emma shook her head, her eyes wide, but I still wasn't convinced. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was my own fingers pushing it without me realizing. I was skeptical, but I went along with it. We asked another question. "Do you know where Jake is?" The planchette started moving, slowly at first, sliding across the board in this jerky, hesitant way that made my skin crawl. It spelled out a single word. "Here." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just nerves. Here could mean anything, right? Maybe it was messing with us. Maybe we were doing it without realizing. But Emma looked freaked out too, and I could tell this wasn't a joke for her. We asked another question, this time more specific. "Can you show us where?" The planchette moved again, this time faster, more confidently. It spelled out coordinates, a string of numbers and letters that neither of us recognized. I grabbed my phone, punching them into Google Maps, and my stomach dropped when the location popped up. It was a small clearing in the woods, not far from Jake's last known location. Emma and I stared at each other, a mix of fear and excitement in our eyes. This was it, a real lead. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was our minds filling in the blanks. But I felt this urge to go, to see for myself. And honestly, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to sleep if I didn't check it out. Against my better judgment, I suggested we go there the next night. Emma was all for it, of course. She was already texting a few of our friends, trying to round up anyone willing to join us. In the end, it was just the two of us and another friend, Lucas, who thought it sounded like a fun adventure. I didn't tell him about the Ouija board. I didn't want to freak him out, and honestly, I was still trying to make sense of it myself. The next night, we met up just after dark. I could tell Lucas thought it was all a big joke, but Emma and I weren't laughing. We drove out to the edge of the woods, parked the car, and made our way toward the coordinates with nothing but our phone flashlights to guide us. The trees closed in around us, their branches arching overhead, turning the night into this endless stretch of darkness. Every step felt heavier, like we were being pulled deeper into something we didn't understand. As we got closer, the air felt different, colder, still. Even Lucas had gone quiet, his usual jokes replaced by a tense, watchful silence. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to find whatever was hidden there. Finally, we reached the clearing. My phone buzzed, and I checked the coordinates. We were dead on. And there, in the center of the clearing, was something strange. Something that shouldn't have been there. A single, abandoned shoe. It was small, covered in mud and half buried under leaves, as if it had been there for weeks. I felt my stomach twist as I stared at it, a creeping horror spreading through me. I recognized that shoe. It was Jake's. He'd worn it 100 times, a beaten-up pair of Converse with a little tear near the heel. We stood there in silence, the weight of it settling over us. This wasn't a joke. This was real. But the Ouija board had given us the location, and somehow I knew that this was only the beginning of what it wanted to show us. We all just stood there, staring at that muddy, half-buried shoe, the weight of it pressing down on us. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. I kept telling myself it was a coincidence, that it couldn't actually be Jake's. But I knew. I'd seen him wear those beat-up Converse 100 times. Lucas was the first to break the silence. So, what now? He laughed a little, but it was this uneasy, hollow sound. He didn't think it was funny anymore. Emma knelt down, carefully brushing the leaves away from the shoe, like she was afraid of what she might find. "I don't know," she whispered, "but this doesn't feel right. I mean, a random shoe in the middle of the woods, right where the board told us." My gut was twisting with this cold, creeping dread, but I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to think we were actually onto something. "Maybe we should look around," I suggested, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. "Maybe there's more." We spread out, our flashlights cutting through the dark in thin, shaky beams, casting strange shadows over the trees. The forest was dead silent, not even the usual sounds of insects or rustling leaves. It was like we'd stumbled into some kind of vacuum, a place where nothing natural belonged. A few feet away, Lucas called out, "Hey, I found something else." His voice sounded strange, like he was trying to keep his cool but barely managing. We hurried over, and my stomach turned when I saw what he was holding. It was a small, frayed piece of fabric, faded red with a thin, familiar black stripe. Jake had this old hoodie, the kind he wore everywhere. He'd had it since high school, practically lived in it. This was definitely a piece of that hoodie. Emma and I exchanged a look, and I could see the fear in her eyes. We hadn't found Jake, but this felt too close, too personal, like we were brushing up against something we weren't meant to find. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. "Okay, this is officially messed up. Should we call someone? The cops, maybe? Emma hesitated, glancing back toward the path. Maybe. But what are we going to tell them? Hey, we found a shoe and a scrap of fabric in the middle of the woods because a Ouija board told us to come here. Lucas scoffed. Yeah, they'd probably think we're on something. I nodded, feeling trapped. Maybe we just keep looking a bit longer. If there's more, we need to know. Reluctantly, we kept going, the three of us moving deeper into the trees, the darkness swallowing us up. Every step felt like we were crossing a line, like we were trespassing somewhere we didn't belong. The cold got sharper, cutting through my jacket, and the silence pressed against my ears, growing heavier by the second. Then, Emma's flashlight caught something. There, just beyond the clearing, was a small, rusted metal box, half buried in the dirt. It looked ancient, like it had been sitting there for years, untouched and forgotten. She knelt down, clearing away the dirt, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of old, worn-out photographs, each one cracked and faded with age. She pulled out the first photo, holding it up to the light, and my heart stopped. It was a picture of Jake. He was standing in front of some old building I didn't recognize, looking younger, almost like a ghost of himself. His face was pale, eyes staring straight ahead, as if he was looking right at us, but the background was what made my blood run cold. Behind him, I could make out the edge of this same forest, the same twisted trees surrounding us now. Emma flipped through the photos, and with each one the images grew more disturbing. Jake looked weaker, his face thinner, his clothes dirtier, like he'd been out here for days. In the last photo, he was sitting in that very same clearing, slumped over with his head down, his hands limp at his sides. Lucas muttered, "This is insane. How are there pictures of Jake out here? And who even took them?" None of us had an answer. All I knew was that every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run and never come back, but I couldn't. Not yet. Emma was shaking, holding that last photo like it might bite her. "What do you think this means?" she whispered. Could he be? I didn't want to finish that thought. I didn't want to think about what these pictures implied. But deep down, I knew we'd found something terrible, something that couldn't be explained. And somehow, that board had led us right to it. Finally, I took a shaky breath. "We need to go back," I said, glancing around the shadows closing in around us. "And we need to bring these with us." Lucas didn't argue, and neither did Emma. We shoved the photos back into the box, closed it up, and made our way out of the clearing, moving fast but trying not to make noise, like we were afraid of waking something. The whole drive home, none of us spoke. The silence hung heavy, filled with the questions we were too afraid to ask. When we finally reached Emma's house, I opened the box one last time, just to make sure the photos were still there, that this hadn't been some hallucination. But as I sifted through them, I noticed something different. A new photo was sitting on top of the stack, one that hadn't been there before. It was a picture of the three of us, standing in the clearing, looking down at Jake's shoe. And in the background, barely visible among the trees, was a shadowy figure, tall and thin, watching us. That picture changed everything. The second I saw it, my blood went cold. It was the three of us, clear as day, standing in that dark clearing. But I couldn't shake my eyes from the figure in the background, a tall, shadowy shape hidden among the trees, watching us. I'd been so focused on the shoe, the photos of Jake, that I hadn't even thought to look around. But someone, or something, had been out there with us, silently watching, recording every second. Lucas swore under his breath, leaning closer to the picture as if getting a better look would make it make sense. "This has to be a prank, right? Someone's screwing with us." But I could see in his face that he didn't believe that any more than I did. There was something about the figure, the way it stood, half hidden and almost blurred, that felt wrong. The longer I looked, the more it seemed like it was waiting. Emma's hands were shaking as she flipped through the other photos, like she was hoping to find an answer in them. But the photos were the same as before, each one showing Jake in worse and worse condition, leading up to that final image in the clearing. And now, there was this new one of us, adding a layer to the nightmare that none of us could explain. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "We need to go back," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We missed something. There's more there." Lucas looked at her like she was crazy. "Are you serious? Go back? After that?" He pointed at the picture, his face pale. "We don't even know what we're dealing with. This could be, I don't know, some kind of setup." But Emma shook her head, her face set in this grim determination I'd never seen in her before. "Whatever's happening, it's connected to Jake. If there's even the slightest chance we can figure this out, don't you want to know?" I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. Leaving things as they were wasn't an option. Not after seeing that figure, not after the way it felt like something out there was drawing us in, like we were part of some twisted game. So, reluctantly, we agreed. The next night, we'd go back to the clearing. The entire day, I felt on edge, like there was this invisible weight pressing down on me, whispering that something was horribly wrong. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew stronger as the sun set. By the time we met up, I could tell we were all feeling it. That same sense of dread, like we were about to step into something we couldn't escape. This time, we went in better prepared, bringing extra flashlights and a couple of pocket knives. It felt silly, maybe even paranoid, but it gave us a sense of control, however small. The drive out to the woods was silent, none of us willing to break the tension. And when we finally reached the edge of the forest, the night felt even darker, thicker, like the shadows had grown in anticipation. As we made our way back to the clearing, every step seemed heavier, our flashlights cutting through the dense darkness, illuminating only thin beams that barely seemed to reach the trees. I could feel my heart pounding with every step, each footfall echoing in the silence, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, we reached the clearing. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The scattered leaves, the muddy shoe, the rusted box lying in the dirt. But there was something different, something subtle and chilling that I couldn't put my finger on. Lucas muttered, "All right, we're here. Now what?" Emma didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, her flashlight moving in slow circles, scanning the edge of the clearing like she was searching for something or someone. I could feel the air growing colder, sharper, cutting through the night like a blade. And then I saw it. A single piece of paper lying on the ground, half buried under leaves. Emma reached down, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. And when she turned it over, we all took a step back. It was a photograph, another one of Jake. This time, he was standing in the exact spot where we were now, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth open as if he was screaming, though the picture was silent, frozen in time. And there, just behind him, was that same shadowy figure, reaching out with long, thin arms, its face a blank, twisted void. Lucas took a shaky breath. "We're leaving. Now." None of us argued. We turned and hurried back through the trees. But the silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt alive, like the shadows were moving, shifting, watching us with unseen eyes. Every step felt like we were being followed, like the darkness itself was reaching out, trying to pull us back. When we finally broke through the tree line, back to the safety of the car, I felt like I could breathe again. But as we piled in, slamming the doors and locking them, I noticed something on the windshield. A small white note, taped neatly in the center. With a sick feeling in my stomach, I reached out, peeled it off, and read the single line scrawled in messy, jagged letters. "You're next." We were silent for the entire drive back, each of us clinging to the tense, suffocating fear that had settled over us. The note with your next was tucked into my pocket, but I could feel its weight, like a burning brand, a reminder that something was out there, watching, waiting. When we finally reached Emma's house, we all piled out, moving in this tight, nervous group, as if staying close would somehow keep us safe. We went down to the basement where it all started, where the Ouija board still sat on the table, waiting for us like it knew we'd be back. Lucas was the first to speak. "I'm done with this. We have to burn that thing or throw it away or something. It's bringing whatever that was into our lives." He pointed at the board with a shaky hand, his face pale. "We're messing with something that doesn't want to be found." Emma's face was drawn, her usual excitement replaced by this haunted, hollow look. "I don't know," she whispered, almost to herself. "Maybe the board didn't bring this to us. Maybe it just showed us what's already there." She looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the board. "Maybe it was a warning." The words settled over us, heavy and chilling. A warning. But a warning against what or who? My mind kept flashing back to that shadowy figure in the photos, the way it seemed to be lurking, waiting, watching Jake, watching us. Against my better judgment, I made a suggestion. "Let's ask it again." The words felt wrong, even as I said them, like I was inviting something dark and terrible into the room. But I was desperate for answers, for some kind of understanding. We'd already gone this far, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if we stopped now, we'd never know what happened to Jake. Emma nodded, though her hands were trembling as she placed them on the planchette. Lucas muttered something under his breath but joined us, his face set in a look of grim resignation. We sat there, all of us silent, the candles casting flickering shadows across the walls. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Is Jake still out there?" For a long, painful moment, nothing happened. The silence pressed down on us, thick and suffocating, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was about to give up, to say this was a mistake, but then the planchette began to move. Slowly, almost reluctantly, it slid across the board, spelling out a single word. "Yes." Emma's breath hitched, and I felt a surge of something between relief and dread. Jake was out there, somewhere. But that didn't explain the shadow, the photos, or the warning. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to ask the next question. "Where is he?" The planchette moved again, this time faster, spelling out another word, one that sent a chill down my spine. "Wait." We exchanged uneasy glances. Wait for what? The board wasn't giving us a location this time, just a command. It was like it was holding something back, teasing us with pieces of information without giving us the full picture. Then, without warning, the planchette jerked, moving in quick, sharp motions, spelling out a new message. "It comes." The words hung in the air, and I felt a wave of icy fear wash over me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, like someone, or something, was standing right behind me, watching. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder, pressing down on us with this suffocating weight. Lucas let go of the planchette, backing away, his face pale. "Nope, I'm out. I'm done with this. Whatever we're talking to, it's not Jake. This thing is playing with us." Emma's eyes were wide, locked on the board, like she couldn't pull herself away. But what if it's telling the truth? What if something is coming? I could feel the tension in the room building, a sense of dread that was almost tangible. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from that basement as possible. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were so close, that there was something here we needed to know. Suddenly, the basement lights flickered, plunging us into momentary darkness before they snapped back on. It was only a split second, but it was enough to set my heart racing, to make me feel like the walls were closing in. We looked at each other, our expressions a mix of fear and disbelief. And then, in the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a shadow slipping across the wall, a tall, thin figure that shouldn't have been there. I whipped around, but there was nothing, just the empty basement, the silence pressing down on us. Emma looked at me, her face pale. "Did you see?" I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I saw it." That was enough. We didn't need any more warnings, any more clues. Whatever was happening, whatever was coming, it was already here. We grabbed the board, wrapped it in an old blanket, and raced up the stairs, desperate to get out of that basement, to put as much distance as possible between us and that shadow. But as we reached the door, I felt something strange. This faint, cold pressure on my shoulder, like a hand pressing down, holding me in place. I froze, too scared to move, and then I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, close enough that I could feel the breath against my ear. "Wait." I stood there, frozen, as the cold, invisible hand gripped my shoulder. The whisper echoed in my head. "Wait." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor, like something was holding me back, forcing me to listen. Emma and Lucas were already outside, shouting my name from the other side of the door. Their voices snapped me out of it, and I stumbled forward, breaking free of that icy grip. I slammed the door behind me, breathing hard, my pulse racing. Emma's face was white with fear, and Lucas looked ready to bolt, but we all knew this wasn't over. Whatever we'd stirred up, it was following us. We agreed that the Ouija board had to go. Right then and there. No more waiting, no more questions. We took it to an old fire pit behind Emma's house, tossed the board and the photos in, and doused them with lighter fluid. None of us spoke as the flames caught, turning the wood and paper into blackened ash. The fire crackled, and for a moment I felt a small sense of relief, like maybe we'd finally broken free. But as we watched, something caught my eye in the flickering light. Among the ashes, where the board had been, was a small charred photograph that hadn't burned. I leaned in, my stomach twisting as I realized what I was looking at. It was us, the three of us standing by the fire exactly as we were now, watching the board burn. And there, in the background, just like in the other photo, was that dark, shadowy figure standing among the trees watching us. Lucas cursed under his breath, stumbling back. How is that even possible?" Emma's voice trembled. "It's not. It can't be." She looked around, her eyes wide with fear. "But it's happening. We're being watched." We stared at the photo, horrified, as the truth sank in. The board hadn't summoned something. It had simply shown us what was already there, lurking, waiting. And now that we'd seen it, there was no going back. We'd invited it in. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every shadow made me jump, my mind racing with images of that figure, always standing just out of sight, always watching. I tried to convince myself it was over, that the fire had destroyed whatever connection we had to it, but deep down, I knew better. The photos, the messages, they were warnings, and the thing we'd found in the woods wasn't going to leave us alone. The next day, I tried to go about my life as if things were normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My phone would glitch, the lights in my apartment would flicker, and there was this constant, oppressive weight in the air, like I was never really alone. A few days later, a package arrived at my door. No return address, no markings, just a plain brown box with my name scrawled across the top in messy, jagged letters. I didn't want to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid, and my heart dropped. Inside was a single, worn-out shoe, mud-caked and beaten up, with a familiar tear near the heel. It was Jake's. I dropped the box, stumbling back, my mind reeling. They'd found him, or at least a part of him. But that didn't make any sense. We'd already been to the spot, had found nothing but clues and warnings, and now it felt like they were bringing pieces of Jake to me, piece by piece, drawing me deeper into this nightmare. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a video, sent with no message, no explanation. With shaking hands, I opened it, my stomach twisting with dread. The screen was dark at first, just static and faint whispers, and then slowly, an image began to form, a grainy, distorted video of my own room. The camera was positioned at the foot of my bed, facing me, capturing me asleep, completely unaware. And then, in the corner of the screen, that same shadow appeared, shifting and stretching, moving toward me, closer and closer. My heart pounded as I watched it reach out, one long, thin arm hovering over my sleeping form, its fingers inches from my face. The screen cut to black, and then a single message appeared: "We're not done." I deleted the video, my hands shaking, but it was pointless. I knew they could reach me whenever they wanted. I could feel the weight of that shadow lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to make its move. It's been a week now, and I haven't heard from Emma or Lucas. They don't answer their phones, and their social media accounts have gone dark. Every night, I sleep with the lights on, my phone by my side, waiting, dreading the moment I'll see another message, another video, because I know that whatever is watching, it's not finished with me yet.